The morning Henry Turner found the covered plate sitting on his fence post. He stood in the cold October air of 1883 and stared at it for a full 2 minutes before he even thought to reach out and touch it. It was not the presence of food that startled him, exactly. It was the impossibility of it. His spread sat 4 miles outside of Harlan Creek, Colorado, at the end of a road that most folks did not take by accident. The nearest neighbor was old Pete Dawson, and Pete had gone to his eternal rest in the spring. Henry had no family within 3 states. No woman had set foot on this property in 4 years. No one had cooked for him in 4 years. Not since Clara had packed her things and climbed into her brother's wagon without looking back, taking with her every domestic warmth the house had ever known, leaving behind only the echo of his own silence and the cast iron pan that she deemed too heavy to carry. 4 years of beans he boiled himself. 4 years of cornbread he burned on the bottom and underbaked in the middle. 4 years of coffee that tasted like scorched regret. 4 years of sitting at a table built for 2 and eating with one hand while he read whatever newspaper he could get from town, folded to the page where the words were least about love or family or anything soft. And now there was a plate on his fence post. He stepped forward, boots crunching the frost-stiff grass, and lifted the cloth that covered it. The smell hit him before his eyes could fully register what he was seeing. Roasted chicken, golden brown, with a crust of herbs he could not immediately name. A mound of mashed potatoes, smooth and pale, with a small well of dark gravy pooled in the center. 2 biscuits, perfectly risen, their tops kissed to a warm amber. A wedge of dried apple pie, wrapped separately in a clean piece of linen and tied with a strip of blue ribbon. Henry Turner, who had not once in 4 years felt anything other than the grim satisfaction of having fed himself and survived another day, felt his throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. He looked left. He looked right. The road was empty in both directions. The morning mist still clung to the low places in the fields, and the only sound was the distant lowing of his cattle and the creak of the fence post in the wind. Whoever had left this was already gone. He carried the plate inside, set it on the table, and sat down in front of it for a long moment without picking up his fork. He was a practical man. He had been practical since birth, or so his mother had told him before she died, half proud and half sorrowful about it. He was 31 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches tall, broad through the shoulders from years of working his own land, with dark hair that had gone a little long at the collar because he had no one to tell him to cut it, and eyes the particular gray-green of a creek in overcast weather. He was not the kind of man who got sentimental over a plate of chicken. And yet he sat there, and the food went cold before he finally picked up the fork. It was the best meal he had eaten in 4 years. He did not sleep well that night. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and thought about herb-roasted chicken and the blue ribbon on the apple pie, and who in the entire county of Crest Ridge would have known where his fence post was and cared enough to put something on it. By morning, he had made a decision. He was going to find out who had done it. He was not a tracker by trade, but he was a rancher, and ranchers who worked alone learned to read the land the way other men read books. He started at the fence post, crouching down in the early morning light, and he read the ground the way it was written. 2 boot prints in the soft dirt at the base of the post, the left one slightly deeper than the right, suggesting either a weight shift from carrying something or a mild favor to one leg. Small boots. A woman almost certainly. The stride length told him she was not short. Medium height, maybe taller. She had approached from the south, from the direction of the road that wound down past the old Caldwell orchard. He followed the prints to where they met the road, and there they were swallowed by the ruts of wagon wheels. He stood up and looked south. Harlan Creek was 3 miles south. He saddled his gray horse, a big steady animal he called Smoke, and rode toward town at a measured pace, watching the road and the fields on either side the way a man watches something he does not fully understand but intends to. Harlan Creek in 1883 was not a large town by any measurement, but it was a real one. It had a church, a schoolhouse, a general store run by a man named Burl Pickett who knew everything and said most of it, a livery, a small hotel that also served as a boarding house, a saloon that stayed loud until midnight and quiet until noon, a barber, and a post office that doubled as the telegraph station. It had approximately 230 residents, depending on the season and how many drifters were passing through. Henry rode to the general store first, because Burl Pickett was in fact the best source of information in the county, even if you had to tolerate a great deal of extra conversation to get at it. Burl was behind his counter arranging tins of peaches when Henry came in, and his face arranged itself into the particular expression it wore when something interesting was coming. "Henry Turner," Burl said, "you look like a man who spent the night thinking." "I need to ask you something," Henry said, coming straight to the point the way he always did. "Has anyone new come through town recently? A woman, medium height, travels alone, knows how to cook." Burl's expression shifted from interested to delighted, which was not entirely what Henry had wanted. "A woman," Burl said. "Well now, what sort of business do you have with a woman?" "I have a question to ask her," Henry said. "That is all." Burl studied him with the frank assessment of a man who had known Henry Turner for 15 years and watched him go through the particular misery of his marriage and its end, and who had opinions about what Henry Turner needed that he mostly kept to himself, mostly. "There is a woman," Burl said slowly. "Came in 4 days ago on the stage from Pueblo. Took a room at the hotel. Ramsey is the name, Della Ramsey. She has been asking about properties to rent in the area, looking to settle somewhere is what she said." Henry felt something shift in his chest, though he kept his face where it was. "She say where she came from before Pueblo?" "She did not," Burl said. "But she bought a good supply of flour and herbs and good quality lard, so whoever she is, she cooks." He looked at Henry with those sharp eyes. "You want to tell me why you are asking about a strange woman the morning after she passed through?" "No," Henry said, and went back out to his horse. He stood on the street for a moment and looked at the hotel, which was a 2-story frame building with a sign that read Harlan Creek Hotel and Boarding House, and a porch that ran the full length of the front face. It was a perfectly ordinary building. He had walked past it 100 times in 4 years without giving it particular thought. He tied smoke to the post in front of it and went inside. The woman at the front desk was Mabel Crone, who ran the boarding house side of the hotel with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it since before the railroad came through and had no patience for nonsense. She looked up when Henry came in. "Mr. Turner," she said. "I am looking for your guest," he said. "Miss Ramsey." Mabel studied him. "She is in the dining room," she said, "having her breakfast. And you will behave yourself, Henry Turner, or I will throw you out myself regardless of your size." "I always behave myself," he said. "You have been known to be extremely blunt," she said. He could not argue with that, so he simply nodded and went through the door she indicated into the small dining room that smelled of coffee and fresh bread. There were 4 tables in the dining room. 3 were empty. At the 4th, sitting with her back to the window so the morning light fell across the table in front of her and left her face in softer shadow, was a woman Henry Turner had never seen before in his life. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark chestnut hair pinned up with less severity than was fashionable, several strands having made their escape around her face, and ears in a way that seemed less like carelessness, and more like the hair simply had its own ideas. Her dress was a practical dark blue, clean and well-made but not fine. She had a quality of stillness about her that he recognized as belonging to people who had learned not to take up more space than necessary. She was reading a letter, or what had been a letter, the pages refolded in her hands, and she was not reading it so much as simply holding it, looking somewhere past it, as though whatever was in it had already been absorbed and now just sat inside her with its weight. She was also, even he could register this, quite remarkably striking. Henry Turner had not thought about any woman being particularly striking in 4 years. He filed the observation away with some discomfort and crossed the room. "Miss Ramsey," he said. She looked up, and her eyes were a warm dark brown that he had not expected. She did not have the startled look of a woman who had been caught at something. She looked at him directly and without flinching, which he found both unusual and unexpectedly pleasant. "Yes," she said. "My name is Henry Turner," he said. "I have a ranch 4 miles north of town at the end of Miller Road. Someone left a meal on my fence post yesterday evening." He paused. "I believe it was you." A pause hung in the air between them. She looked at him steadily. Something crossed her face, a flicker of something that might have been caught out or might have been the beginning of amusement. He was not practiced enough in reading faces any more to tell which. "Why would you believe that?" she said. "Boot prints in the dirt," he said. "Small, your size. Came from the direction of this road. You came in 4 days ago. You have been buying provisions, and you are the only person in this town who is new enough not to know that I do not generally invite people to leave things on my property." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down, Mr. Turner." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, because it seemed like the sensible thing to do, and because she had said it with the tone of someone who was about to say something real. "I was not trying to intrude on your property," she said. "I was walking out past the old Caldwell place to see the land. I had cooked a meal at the boarding house kitchen, which Mrs. Crone was kind enough to allow me to use, and I had made too much." She stopped, looked at him, decided something. "That is not the whole truth. I had heard in town that there was a man who lived alone out that road and that he had been living that way for some years, and I suppose I had some notion that a meal would not go amiss. I was not thinking clearly about whether it would be welcome or strange. I see now that it was perhaps strange." "It was not unwelcome," Henry said, and then stopped, because that had come out more directly than he had meant it. He tried again. "What I mean to say is that it was a very good meal. I came to thank you for it." She looked at him with those dark eyes, and this time he was almost certain it was the beginning of amusement. "You tracked me down to say thank you." "Yes," he said. "You tracked my boot prints 3 miles into town." "4 miles," he said. "I live 4 miles out." She pressed her lips together briefly. Definitely amusement. "Most people would have simply let it go," she said. "I am not most people," he said, and that came out truer than he had meant as well, and something about the truth of it seemed to make her expression change, the amusement softening into something he had even less of a word for. "No," she said quietly. "I suspect you are not." A silence settled between them, not an uncomfortable one, which surprised him. Mabel Crone came through and poured coffee into the second cup on the table without asking, which suggested she had been listening through the door and had made certain calculations. Henry wrapped his hands around the cup because it was cold outside, and he had ridden in without gloves. Della Ramsey watched him do it with the small, careful attention of someone who notices things. "Where did you come from, Miss Ramsey?" he asked, because it seemed like the natural next question. Something moved behind her eyes. Not pain exactly. Something older than pain, something that had been pain and was now just a quiet fact. "Kansas," she said. "Before that, Ohio. I have been moving west for 2 years." "Running from something or toward something?" he asked, and immediately thought that was too blunt. It was too blunt. He was too blunt. He opened his mouth to say something less sharp, but she answered. "Both," she said simply. "The running from part is mostly done. I am working on the toward part." He looked at her. She looked at him. The coffee steamed between them. "What do you do?" he asked. "For work?" "I cook," she said. "I bake. In Kansas, I worked in a hotel kitchen for 1.5 years. Before that, I kept house for a family in Ohio." She folded her hands on the table with a composure that he recognized now as the composure of someone who had needed it for practical reasons. "I am looking for a place to settle, something of my own or close to it, a position in a kitchen or a property I might rent and use to cook for boarding houses or ranches, something steady." "Have you found anything?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "There is not much available. What is available is not yet within my means." Henry looked at his coffee. He was a practical man. He had always been a practical man. The thought that entered his head at that moment was entirely practical, or so he told himself in the space of the next 3 seconds before he said it. "I have a ranch," he said, "and I cannot cook worth anything. I eat the same 5 things in rotation and none of them are particularly good. I pay fair wages." He paused. "I am not saying what it might sound like I am saying. I am saying that if you wanted work while you looked for something of your own, I would pay you a fair wage to cook 1 meal a day and keep the kitchen in order. You would have your own room. You would have your days mostly free. And Mrs. Crone could vouch for me being reasonably harmless, which I believe she would do." He stopped. The directness of what he had just done sat in the air, and he could not decide if it was sensible or the strangest thing he had done in years. Della Ramsey looked at him for a long time. He could see her thinking, the small movements of consideration behind her face, the weighing of things against other things. She was not a foolish woman. She was not a reckless one. She had clearly been careful for a long time, making careful choices for practical reasons, and this was another choice of that kind, and she was treating it with the seriousness it deserved. "You came here to thank me for leaving a meal on your fence post," she said, "and you have ended by offering me employment." "Yes," he said, "I am aware of how that sounds." "How does it sound to you?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Like I'm a practical man who has eaten poor food for 4 years and stumbled on a solution," he said. "And to me," she said, "it sounds like a reasonable offer from a man who was honest enough to come and find me rather than simply eating the meal and forgetting it." She looked at him. "I will speak to Mrs. Crone. If she tells me you are who you appear to be, I will consider it." "That is fair," he said. He stood up. She stood up too, which caught him slightly off guard, and he realized she was taller than he had initially registered, or maybe it was simply that she stood up straighter than most people. The top of her head came to his chin. She extended her hand and he shook it, which was not entirely the usual custom but felt right for a woman who was conducting her own business in her own terms. "Mr. Turner," she said. "Miss Ramsey," he said. He left his coffee half finished, nodded to Mabel Crone, who was entirely too composed in the hallway, and went back out to his horse with the distinct and unusual sensation that something had just begun. He spent the rest of the day doing what he always did, which was work. He was methodical about his work in the way that lonely men often become, because the structure of it kept the days from collapsing into formlessness. He had 300 head of cattle, a small herd by some standards but well managed, 2 ranch hands who came by the day when there was more work than one man could do, and a piece of land that required more attention than it got because there was only one of him. He mended a stretch of fence on the east pasture, checked on a heifer that had been off her feed, and brought in the last of the firewood he had split the previous week. Normal work, good work. Work that had always been enough to fill the hours. It had been enough, at least. Today it felt thinner than usual, and he could not fully account for why. He cooked himself supper that evening. Beans from the pot he kept going, cornbread and coffee. He ate standing at the stove because there was no real reason to set the table for one. The kitchen was a large room, bigger than necessary for one person, with good windows on 2 sides and a wood stove that heated well, and a countertop of smooth pine that was worn from years of use. Clara had always said the kitchen was the best room in the house. He had mostly been grateful for her, because she filled it with smells that meant something. Tonight it smelled like his beans and nothing else. He washed his plate and went to bed. 2 days passed. He told himself he had made the offer and it was entirely up to Della Ramsey what she did with it, and he was not going to think about it further. He thought about it constantly. He went to town on the 2nd day for supplies and stopped at the general store where Burl Pickett informed him, without being asked, that Miss Ramsey had indeed spoken with Mabel Crone at some length, and that the 2 of them had seemed to reach some kind of agreement about something, and that Miss Ramsey had also been seen talking with Tom Wells at the livery about the road north. Henry said thank you and bought his supplies and rode home, and told himself he was not watching the road south from his kitchen window the next morning. He was absolutely watching the road south from his kitchen window. She arrived at 9:30 on a morning that had gone from cloudy to clear, riding in the seat of a rented wagon with a trunk in the back, and a burlap sack that clinked gently with the particular sound of jars and tins. She drove the wagon herself, handling the horse with the competent ease of a woman who had done it before, and she pulled up at his front gate and looked at the house with an expression he could not read from the window. He went out to meet her. "Miss Ramsey," he said, "you found it all right." "Your directions were very clear," she said. She looked at the house. It was a decent house, built solid, 2 stories with a covered porch and good windows. He took some small pride in the fact that it was well kept. He kept things in order out of stubbornness or habit, he was not sure which. "It is a good-looking place," she said. "I will get your trunk," he said. He helped her down from the wagon seat first, because that was how he had been raised, and she accepted the hand without making it strange, stepping down with the practical grace of someone comfortable in their own body. He got the trunk and she got the sack of supplies, and he showed her inside. He had spent the previous afternoon cleaning. He was not going to tell her that, but the evidence of it was visible in the swept floors and the scrubbed countertops, and the fact that there was absolutely nothing on the kitchen table except a single clear glass lamp. She walked through the kitchen with her dark eyes taking everything in with that careful attention he had already come to recognize as her particular way of engaging with the world. "This is a good stove," she said. It was a large cast iron range he had bought 3 years ago from a catalog, because he might not be able to cook, but he believed in good equipment. "Good draw." "Very good," he said. "No smoke problems." She opened a cabinet and found it nearly empty. She opened another and found his provisions, which were adequate in terms of raw materials and extremely limited in terms of variety and inspiration. She looked at them with the expression of someone who was already planning something and keeping it to herself. "I brought some things," she said, lifting the burlap sack. "Herbs I like to use, and some preserves I put up in the hotel kitchen. Mrs. Crone said I could have the use of the extras." "You can put your things wherever you want in this kitchen," he said. "It is your domain." She glanced at him. "My domain," she repeated. "That is the word for it," he said. "I only come in here to eat." Something that might have been a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. He had the sense that she had a real smile somewhere behind the careful composure, and that it came out infrequently and was probably worth waiting for. "Show me my room, then," she said. He had given her the spare room at the back of the house, which had its own window looking east and a good solid door with a latch, and was a perfectly respectable distance from his own room at the front. He had put clean linens on the narrow bed and a rag rug on the floor that had been in the house when he bought it, and that he had never known what else to do with. She set her things down and stood in the middle of the small room, and he thought she might be the kind of person who needed a moment to settle herself into new spaces. So he said, "Supper whenever you like," and left her to it. He heard her moving around in the kitchen at about 4 o'clock, and the smells that began to come out of it an hour later were so different from what that kitchen had produced in 4 years that he sat on the porch in the cold and breathed them in like a man who had forgotten what air was supposed to taste like. She called him in at 6. She had made a pork and vegetable stew with herbs he could not identify, but which made the whole thing taste like something that belonged in a dining room in a city, not on a ranch in Crest Ridge County. There was bread, fresh, still warm. There was butter she had apparently been carrying in a small crock in her burlap sack. She had set the table for 2, which stopped him briefly in the kitchen doorway, because he had not sat across from anyone at this table in a very long time. She was already seated, serving herself without ceremony, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Sit down before it gets cold." He sat down. They ate. The stew was extraordinary. He said so. She thanked him without excessive modesty and without false dismissal, just accepted it straight, which he respected. "Do you want to know why I left the meal on your fence post?" she asked, somewhere in the middle of the bread. He looked up. "You told me," he said, "you had cooked too much." "I told you the part that was practical," she said. She was looking at the table rather than at him, which he noticed because she was generally a person who looked directly. "The other part is harder to explain without sounding sentimental." "Go ahead," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I came past your place and I saw the smoke from the chimney, and Burl Pickett had told me without me asking that you had lived alone out here for 4 years and that you did your own cooking and that your cooking was the subject of some sympathy in town." A small pause. "I had been alone for 2 years on the road, and I know what it is like to eat without anyone to eat with. I thought that if someone left a good meal somewhere you were, it might be." She stopped. "It sounds very small when I say it out loud." "It does not sound small," Henry said. He meant it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his stew. "I sat in front of that plate for 5 minutes before I ate any of it, because of how it felt to have someone think to do it." She looked up at him then, and that was the first real thing that passed between them. Not the practical arrangement of the hire, not the careful courtesy of the introductions, but something direct and honest, and a little fragile in the way that real things often are. He looked away first, back at his bowl, because he was a man who had learned to be careful about what he let himself feel, and the sensation of feeling something was both welcome and alarming. "How long were you in Kansas?" he asked, which was a subject change and they both knew it, but she let him take it. 18 months, she said. "I worked at the Danville Hotel in Abilene. It was good work. The kitchen manager, a woman named Bertha Crane, she was very good. I learned a great deal from her." Something shadowed slightly in her face. "She passed away in the spring. After that the hotel changed management, and the new manager had certain ideas about how the kitchen staff should be organized that I did not agree with." "What kind of ideas?" he asked, because something in the way she said it suggested it was not simply a difference of professional opinion. She met his eyes. "The kind that assumed that a woman working alone without family nearby was available to be taken advantage of," she said plainly. "I was not available. I left." Henry absorbed this. He felt a slow, quiet anger on her behalf that he did not express because it was not his to express, and because she had clearly dealt with it herself and come out intact. "Good," he said. "That you left." "Yes," she said. "I have always left before anything came of it, but it gets tiring," she added, in a tone so matter-of-fact that it landed harder than a complaint would have. "Always having to read the room, always knowing where the door is." "You know where the door is here," he said, "and I will tell you plainly that that is not the nature of this arrangement and never will be. Your room has a latch. The arrangement is employment. That is all it is." She looked at him for a long moment. "Mrs. Crone said you were a man of your word," she said. "I am," he said. "Then I believe you," she said. And she went back to her stew with the composure of a woman who had been making these kinds of assessments for years and had gotten reasonably good at them. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Henry was not sure he had a name for. They were domestic weeks, in the straightforward sense that the house was warm and smelled of food, and there was someone else's lamp burning in the evenings. But they were something else too, something he circled around without approaching directly. Della cooked one good meal a day, as agreed, usually in the evening, occasionally at midday when the work of the day allowed. She kept the kitchen in a state of order and productivity that he found quietly astonishing. She put herbs in bunches to dry from the kitchen rafters. She organized his provisions in a system that made sense. She sourced things from town on the days she drove the wagon in, coming back with packages and bundles and occasional live chickens that she installed in a corner of the barn, and that began within a week to produce eggs with an enthusiasm that suggested they were grateful for the change. She was not a woman who talked for the sake of filling silence. He appreciated that enormously. They had developed in the first 2 weeks a rhythm of conversation that felt natural rather than obligatory. They talked at meals. Sometimes they sat on the porch in the evenings for a while before she went in. They talked about the land, which she was clearly curious about and was learning to read with the same kind of methodical attention she applied to everything. They talked about cooking, which was a subject she knew deeply and which he found more interesting than he had expected. They talked about the town and its people because she had begun to know them and had opinions. She had strong opinions. He discovered this by degrees. She was quiet with them, not combative, but they were there and they were firm, and she did not retreat from them when he pushed back, which he occasionally did, not to antagonize her but because he found the pushing back interesting. She pushed back at him too, without flinching, and he found that even more interesting. What he did not do in those first weeks was think about her in the terms he increasingly wanted to think about her. He was scrupulous about this. He had made a promise, implicit and explicit, about the nature of the arrangement, and he was a man of his word. He was also a man who had been wrong about love before in a way that had cost him considerably, and he was not going to be reckless. But there were moments. There was the morning she was working at the kitchen counter, and he came in for something, and she turned and reached for the shelf above her head for a jar, and the morning light came through the east window and caught in her hair, and he stopped in the doorway with whatever he had come in for completely forgotten. There was the afternoon she came out to the east pasture, where he was working with a heifer that had gotten her leg tangled in some fence wire, and without being asked, she held the animal's head and spoke to her in a low, steady voice while he worked the wire free. And she did it with such calm competence that the heifer barely struggled. And when it was done, he looked up and found Della looking back at him with a satisfaction in her face that was the satisfaction of work done right. And something shifted in his chest like a door, opening a little more than it had been. There was the evening 3 weeks in when a cold rain came in fast from the northwest, and he was trying to get the cattle to the high pasture before it hit. And she saw what was happening from the kitchen window and came out in her coat and helped him without discussion, riding the old mare he kept for riding around the property. And she knew how to work cattle, which he had not expected. She had grown up on a farm in Ohio. She told him afterward, dripping in the barn while they dried off, and she had worked cattle before she had worked kitchens. And something about that particular piece of information, the image of her young and capable and already competent in the world, made him look at her in a way that he had to look away from quickly. One evening in mid-November, with the first real snow of the season coming down outside, and the kitchen warm and bright and smelling of the venison stew she had made with the deer he had brought in the week before, she said, without particular preamble, "You have not asked me about the running from part." He looked up from the newspaper he had been reading at the other end of the table. She was knitting, or trying to. She had told him she was learning, and the evidence was visible in the slightly irregular rows. She was looking at the knitting rather than at him. "You will tell me if you want to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "My husband died," she said, "in Kansas, before Abilene. He was a farmer. We went out to Kansas in 1880 because the land was available and he believed in it. And in 1881 he got sick in October and he was gone by December." A pause. "He was a good man. It was not a dramatic story. It was just a sad one." Henry was quiet, giving her room. "After he died, I had no property of my own because everything was in his name, which was the law," she said, with a flatness in her voice that told him exactly how she felt about the law. "And his family did not want me on the land without him. So I went to Abilene and found work." She looked up at him. "I am telling you because I think you should know that I am not a woman who is unacquainted with loss, and because I think you might understand that particular kind of starting over." He put down his newspaper. "I do understand it," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "My wife did not die, she left, which is a different kind of loss, but a loss nonetheless." Della looked at him with those dark eyes that were warm and level and did not do anything so uncomfortable as offer pity. "How long ago?" she asked. "4 years," he said, "which you might have calculated from the fence post." The corner of her mouth moved. "I had," she admitted. "We were wrong for each other," he said. It was the most he had said about Clara to anyone. "She wanted things I did not have to give, and I wanted things she could not be. Neither of us was bad, we were just wrong." He looked at his hands on the newspaper. "It took me a long time to see it that clearly." "It takes time," she said, in a way that suggested she was speaking from experience. "Yes," he said. The fire crackled. The snow came down outside. He picked his newspaper back up and she went back to her knitting. But the air between them had changed, had something more in it than it had before, the particular density of two people who have told each other true things. By the time December came in properly, Henry Turner was in a state he had not been in for a long time and which he recognized with some alarm as being in considerable danger of falling in love. He managed it, or attempted to manage it, in the way practical men manage inconvenient feelings, by working harder and talking less, and spending more time on the far sections of the property so that the evenings were short, and he was tired enough to sleep without lying awake thinking about specific dark eyes and the particular way she said his name, which she had shifted from Mr. Turner to Henry sometime in November without ceremony or announcement. She noticed the working harder. He could tell because she watched him come in some evenings with the particular look of a woman who has filed an observation away and will return to it. The thing that broke through his careful management was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday morning in early December, with the ground frozen hard and the sky the particular gray-white of incoming weather, and he was coming out of the barn to find her standing at the fence that ran alongside the house looking south, with an expression on her face that he had not seen before and that stopped him in the barn doorway. It was not sadness exactly. It was the look of someone standing at the edge of something and considering whether to step off. He went to the fence and stood beside her. "What are you looking at?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking," she said, "that this feels like a place." He was not entirely sure what she meant, but he thought he understood it. "Feels like somewhere to be," he said. "Yes," she said. She looked at him sideways. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said. She looked back south. "I have not had that feeling in 2 years," she said. "I am not sure what to do with it." He stood beside her at the fence and looked south too. The fields were brown and frost-stiff, and the road ran down toward town through the bare cottonwoods that lined it, and the sky was big over everything in the way that sky is big in Colorado, a size that either oppresses or sustains depending on the person and the day. "You could stay," he said. It came out quieter than he expected. "If that is what the feeling means." She turned and looked at him fully, not sideways this time, straight the way she looked at things she was taking seriously. "As your cook," she said. He looked at her. He was a practical man and he had managed things very carefully and he was not practiced at this anymore and he was probably going to say this badly and he was going to say it anyway. "If that is what you wanted," he said. Or as something else, if that were wanted. The world was very quiet for a moment. A crow called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. "Something else," she said slowly. "Such as what?" "I would not say something I did not mean," he said. "And I am not going to say something that puts you in a position you don't want to be in. But I would be lying if I said this was only an employment arrangement to me anymore." He met her eyes. "I am aware that is complicated, given the arrangement, and I would not press it, but you asked, and I am not a man who lies." She looked at him for a long time. He held still under the looking, which was not easy. "You are a very direct person," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "I have been told that is not always welcome." "I find it welcome," she said. And then she looked back south again and was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than before, the kind that has something live in it. 2 days passed. He was scrupulous and appropriate and entirely careful. She cooked supper and they ate it and talked about the cattle and the snow that was coming and the letter she had received from a woman she had known in Abilene. He told himself he had said what he had said and it was enough and she would answer in her own time or not at all, and either outcome was one he would live with. On the evening of the second day she came into the sitting room where he was reading by the lamp and sat in the chair across from him and said, "Henry." He put the book down. "I have been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been careful for a long time," she said. "I have had to be careful. I am not always certain whether I am still being appropriately careful or whether I have been careful so long that I am being careful when there is nothing left to be careful about." He waited. He was very good at waiting when it mattered. "I think," she said slowly, choosing words the way she chose everything with deliberate attention, "that you are someone I would like to know better, in the way you meant." She met his eyes. "If you are still meaning it." "I am still meaning it," he said. She nodded once as though that settled something. "Then we will figure out what that looks like," she said, with a practicality that was entirely hers and that he found in that moment enormously endearing. "Yes," he said. She went back to the kitchen. He picked up his book. He read the same paragraph 4 times and retained none of it, because he was thinking about the fact that Della Ramsey had just agreed to let him court her, or something like it, in terms as direct and unceremonious as anything he had ever heard, and that it was very possibly the best thing that had happened to him in 4 years, and that he had not eaten a meal he hadn't cooked himself for 4 years until she put one on his fence post. And now here she was in his kitchen and his sitting room and his days, and he had the distinct and unfamiliar sensation of being a man whose life was turning towards something rather than away from it. What followed was not a courtship in the parlor calling sense of the word. There were no calling cards and no formal parlor visits and no chaperones, because they lived in the same house and worked in the same daily proximity, and there was nothing artificial available to perform. What it was more honest than that, and more real. He brought her things from town that she had mentioned needing, and she noticed every time and said thank you in a way that meant it. She left his coffee ready in the mornings before he was up, because she woke early and he had told her once that he liked coffee immediately on rising, and she remembered. He built her a better shelf system in the kitchen for her herbs and jars, taking an entire Saturday afternoon for it with wood he planed himself. She came out and watched him work and brought him coffee in the cold and sat on the fence rail, and they talked while he worked. And that afternoon was one of the better ones he could remember in recent history. He took her to town on Saturdays, because she had business there and he had business there, and they went together in the wagon, which was practical, and also led to sitting side by side on the wagon seat in a way that was not unpleasant. Burl Pickett noticed immediately, with visible satisfaction, and was tactful enough not to say anything directly, which was a mark of considerable personal growth. One Saturday in mid-December, they stayed late in town because there was a small social at the schoolhouse, the kind of community gathering that happened several times a year where people drank cider and someone played a fiddle, and the children ran in circles until they fell over. Henry had not gone to a social in town in 2 years. Della had not been to one in Harlan Creek at all. They went together because it made sense to go together, and because Henry had asked her and she had said yes. He helped her down from the wagon outside the schoolhouse, and she took his arm going up the steps in a way that was natural and uncomplicated. And when they went inside, he was aware of the small ripple that moved through the people who knew him, which was most of the people there, as they registered the fact of her on his arm. He ignored it entirely. Della, he noticed, held her head at the particular angle of someone who is used to being looked at and has made peace with it. A man named Cal Briggs, who was the county's self-appointed social arbiter, and a person Henry had limited patience for, came over within 5 minutes and asked, with great apparent friendliness, whether Henry had hired himself a housekeeper, with the particular emphasis on housekeeper that made it not really a question about housekeeping at all. Henry looked at him with the gray-green eyes that had flattened to the color of winter water and said, "Miss Ramsey is my guest this evening and a person I have considerable respect for, Cal, and I would appreciate it if you spoke accordingly." Cal Briggs said, of course," and removed himself. Della, at his side, said nothing, but her hand on his arm tightened very slightly, which he thought might mean any number of things and which he chose to think meant something particular. The fiddle player was a 15-year-old boy named Jonah Fry, who was startlingly talented for his age, and the music was good, and someone had brought an excellent cider, and the children ran in circles and fell over in sequence, and at some point during the evening, Henry found himself dancing with Della Ramsey in a schoolhouse in Harlan Creek, Colorado, which was the last thing he would have predicted about his December when October had started. She danced the way she did most things, with competence and a contained pleasure that was its own kind of warmth. He was not a notable dancer, but he knew the steps well enough, and she was easy to lead, or rather she made it easy, responding to his lead with an attentiveness that felt like the same attentiveness she brought to everything. They did not speak much while they danced. They did not need to. When the music slowed to a waltz and he shifted his hold accordingly, he was aware of her face being close to his shoulder, and the smell of whatever she put in her hair, something with lavender in it, and the fact that she had settled into the dance with a kind of ease that she reserved for things she had decided she was comfortable with. He was careful and appropriate. He was also in the privacy of his own chest, somewhere between profound contentment and the particular ache of wanting more than he was yet allowing himself to want. "You are a better dancer than I expected," she said into the general space of the music. "What did you expect?" he asked. "A man who walks everywhere like he is measuring the distance," she said. He laughed, which surprised him. He did not laugh easily or often, and it came out genuine and brief, and she looked up at him when it happened with an expression that he saw for only a second before she looked back to the room. But in that second, it was the warmest thing he had seen in a very long time. They drove home in the cold and the dark with the stars out enormously over the Colorado plain, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat with her coat buttoned and her breath visible in the cold air. And somewhere in the last mile before the house she leaned slightly, not dramatically, just slightly, so that her shoulder was against his, and he did not say anything and neither did she. And he drove the rest of the way in the cold dark feeling entirely, unutterably warm. Christmas came. He had not done much for Christmas in the past 4 years, there being little point in decorating for one person, but Della cut pine boughs from the trees at the creek and put them in the windows and on the mantel, and brought a length of red ribbon from town, and the house looked and smelled better than it had in years. She made a Christmas dinner that he was quite certain could have appeared in a fancy hotel without embarrassment: a roasted goose, sweet potatoes, green beans she had preserved in summer, a proper pudding. He ate 2 plates and she looked satisfied in the quiet way she had when something had gone the way she intended. He had gotten her a gift. He had thought about it more than he would admit. He had found, at the Mercantile in the larger town of Grantsville, 20 miles east, where he had made a special trip, a small set of very fine kitchen knives in a leather roll with rosewood handles, the kind a serious cook would use and appreciate. He had wrapped them in brown paper and felt awkward about it right up until she opened them and went still and then looked up at him with the particular shine that sometimes appeared in her eyes when something moved her, which she usually did not let show, and said, "Henry, these are beautiful." "I thought you might use them," he said, which was a very small thing to say in response to that look, but it was what he had. "I will use them every day," she said. She had gotten him something, too, which he had not expected: a book on the history of cattle ranching in the American West, which was exactly the kind of book he liked and which she had clearly paid attention to know. He held it and looked at it and said, "Thank you, Della," and looked at her over it, and they were standing very close in the sitting room with the pine smell and the ribbon and the fire going, and he thought this was the moment, if there was going to be a moment, but she stepped back and said she needed to check the goose, and the moment was not quite that. But it was close. He could feel the closeness of it. The new year came in cold and clear. January in Crest Ridge County was not forgiving, and Henry worked double time in the worst of it, keeping the cattle from the worst of the weather, breaking ice on the water troughs twice a day, spending the coldest nights in the barn with a lantern to be sure the animals were managing. He came in on those nights very late and very cold, and there was always, she always somehow knew when he was coming in, a pot kept warm on the back of the stove and coffee ready, and he sat in the kitchen in his coat with his hands wrapped around the cup, and his fingers slowly coming back to life. And sometimes, she sat across from him in the night-quiet kitchen, and they talked in low voices about nothing in particular, and those were some of the best hours of his life, which he acknowledged to himself with a kind of wondering disbelief. He kissed her for the first time in late January. It was not planned. They had been in the barn together. There was a mare foaling, and it was a complicated birth, and they had both been there for 4 hours. And when the foal finally came in properly and stood on its astonishing long legs in the lamplight, they both exhaled at once and looked at each other with the shared relief and exhaustion of people who have been through something together. And he kissed her, once, brief and gentle, and she kissed him back, brief and real. And then they stood in the lamp-warm barn with the foaling mare and the new foal, and looked at each other in the particular way of people for whom something has just stopped being unspoken. "Henry," she said. "Yes," he said. She took his hand, held it. He looked down at her hand in his, which was a capable hand, slightly rough from kitchen work, warm. He closed his own hand around it. "I think," she said, "that I would like to stay here." "Then stay," he said, "for as long as you want." She looked up at him. "I mean," she said carefully, "that I would like to stay here in a way that is not precisely an employment arrangement." He looked at her. He was aware that his heart was doing something undignified. "In what kind of way?" he asked, because he was a practical man who needed things said plainly, even when they were obvious. She looked at him with those warm, dark eyes and said, with the directness that was entirely hers, "In the way where I am not your cook, Henry. In the way where I am someone else entirely." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamp light with the foal shifting softly in the straw behind them. Then he said, "I have been wanting to ask you to be that since about 3 weeks after you arrived, and I have been exercising considerable restraint because I did not want to confuse what I said I was offering with what I found I was feeling." She made a sound that might have been a small laugh. "I know," she said. "You know," he said. "Henry," she said with great patience, "I have been watching you exercise considerable restraint for 2 months. It was very obvious and also very kind, and I want you to stop." He laughed again, the genuine kind that didn't come easy, and she smiled at him, the real one that he had been waiting for, the one that came from behind all the careful composure, wide and warm and unguarded, and it was, in his honest assessment, the finest thing he had seen in years. He brought her hands up and kissed them, which felt right, and she let him, which felt even better, and the mare behind them shuffled comfortably in the straw. He asked her to marry him in February properly, with thought and intention. He had a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet that he had kept in a box in his bureau for years without knowing what else to do with it. He asked her after supper, in the kitchen, which was perhaps not the most romantic setting but was entirely the right one, because the kitchen was hers in the way that a room becomes a person's when they fill it with themselves over months, and because it was where they had first become honest with each other, and because practicality and romance are not mutually exclusive, which he had decided firmly. Said, "Della, I want to ask you something." She had been at the counter and she turned around and she looked at him with those eyes, and he thought she already knew what was coming because she always already knew things. He said, "I know that you came here to find something of your own. I know that what you want is not to belong to someone else's life but to have one of your own making. I am not asking you to give that up. I am asking you, if you want to build something with me. I am asking you to marry me. Not because it is the logical conclusion of the arrangement, but because you are the best person I have been near in a very long time, and because I love you, which I have known for some months and have been waiting for the right moment to say." She was very still. The kitchen was warm around her and the lamps were lit, and she was standing there with her dark hair and her quiet face and her hands at her sides, and then she said, "You love me." "Yes," he said, "considerably." "Since when?" she asked with genuine curiosity, which was such an entirely Della Ramsey question that it nearly undid him. "Since the apple pie," he said, "the one with the blue ribbon, on the fence post." She looked at him and then she laughed the full warm laugh and crossed the kitchen to him, and he held out the ring, and she held out her hand, and it was as simple as that. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Henry Turner." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment on her hand, and then she looked up at him and said, "I love you too, since approximately the barn in January, though I suspected it sooner." "Only approximately," he said. "It was a process," she said. He kissed her properly then, in the lamplight kitchen, and she kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything, fully and with her whole attention, and he thought, standing in his kitchen with his grandmother's ring on her finger, that he had been a lonely and practical and stubborn man for a very long time, and that a covered plate on a fence post had begun the end of all that, and that life was strange and frequently better than you expected, if you were willing to track down the person who left the plate. They were married in March, when the snow was beginning to thin and the first tentative greenness was coming back to the Colorado plain. It was a small ceremony, because neither of them wanted a large one, in the church in Harlan Creek, with Reverend Miles officiating and Burl Pickett in the front row looking as though this was entirely his doing, and Mabel Crone beside him dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had clearly come prepared with. Tom Wells from the livery was there. Several of the townspeople who had come to know Della over the winter were there. The woman she had corresponded with from Abilene had written a letter that was read at the small gathering afterward. Della wore a dress she had made herself over the winter, a deep green that made her eyes look like the warmest version of dark, and her hair was pinned up more carefully than usual with small sprigs of dried lavender, because it was March and there were no fresh flowers yet, but she had thought of something. Henry wore his good coat, which he had taken to the dry goods woman to be properly pressed, and Della, when she saw him, looked at him with a warmth in her face that made him straighten up and feel, for once in a very long time, exactly where he was supposed to be. They said their vows in the clear, straightforward language of the Book of Common Prayer, and when it was done, and he kissed his wife for the first time as his wife, Burl Pickett made a sound of satisfaction that was audible throughout the church, and Mabel Crone gave him a look, and he composed himself immediately. The spring that followed was the kind of spring that comes like a gift after a hard winter, warm and fast, with everything greening up in a rush, and the cattle growing restless with health, and the creek running high and clear. Henry worked the land with a renewed energy that he recognized as the particular energy of a man who has a reason to build things, and Della moved through their days with an ease that told him she had settled fully into her choice and was comfortable in it. She turned the kitchen garden into something serious. She had plans for it all winter, drawings on paper, and in the spring she put them into effect with the methodical efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. By May there were rows of vegetables in the dark soil alongside the south wall of the house, and by summer the kitchen was full of things she had grown herself, and the meals she made with them had a particular quality that he could taste as pride. She also, by summer, had established a small business of her own. 2 of the boarding houses in Harlan Creek had been taking on extra boarders with the growth of the town, and they needed reliable suppliers of preserved goods, jams, jellies, pickled vegetables, dried herbs. Della supplied them. She had talked to Henry about it in March before they were married, and he had said, "That is a good idea," and then helped her source the jars and the additional supplies she needed, and she had looked at him with the quiet intensity she sometimes had and said, "Thank you for not thinking it is less than you." "It is more than me," he said. "You are more than me in most respects, Della. I am a man who ate bad beans for 4 years." She had laughed at that, and it was still, many months later, his favorite sound. In August, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, which was the appropriate room, in the morning, which was the right time. She said it plainly, the way she said things, and watched his face for his reaction with the slightly watchful quality she sometimes had when she was not sure of something. He sat down. He was not sure he had planned to sit, but he sat. He looked at her standing there in the August morning kitchen with the light on her face and the warmth in her eyes and the smallest uncertainty around her mouth. He said, "Come here." She came, and he stood back up and put his arms around her and held her with the full force of what he felt, which was something so large it did not have a word the way most large things don't, and she held him back with the same force, her face against his shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked into his shoulder, muffled. "Della," he said, "I am happier than I know how to tell you." She pulled back and looked at him. The uncertainty was gone. In its place was the full, warm smile, the real one. "Then I am happy," she said. Their son was born in April of 1885. A cold early morning with the doctor come out from town and Mabel Crone there, because Della had asked her to be, and Henry in the next room, who had been sent out of the way, and who paced the boards of the sitting room floor for 3 hours with a concentrated helplessness that was new and not pleasant. When the baby's cry finally came through the door, he stopped pacing and stood perfectly still in the middle of the room and felt something happen inside him that rearranged things at a fundamental level. Mabel Crone came out and said, "You have a son, Henry, and your wife is fine, and you may go in." He went in. Della was sitting up in the bed with the baby in her arms, and she was tired in the specific, profound way of women who have just done a difficult thing. And she was looking at the small face of the person in her arms with an expression he had never seen on her before, absolute and unguarded and beyond the careful composure, just entirely open, all the way down. She looked up when he came in, and her face opened further, if that was possible, and she said, "Henry, come and look." He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at their son, who was red and wrinkled and considerably displeased with the world, and who had a small dark fuzz on his head and fingers no larger than buttons. Henry had held babies before in his life, the children of neighbors and cousins, and he had always managed it competently and felt relatively little. This was not like that. He held out his hands, and Della transferred the baby to him, and he sat holding his son in the April morning while his wife leaned against his shoulder, and the doctor and Mabel Crone quietly saw themselves out. "What do we call him?" Della said. "I thought James," he said, "if you like it." "James," she said, trying it. "James Turner." "My father's name," he said. "Then James," she said. James Turner slept with the ferocious contentment of the newly arrived, and his parents sat together in the April morning and held him and held each other, and the light came in through the bedroom window, and everything was very quiet and very full. James grew with the particular speed of ranch babies, healthy and determined and interested in everything. By the time he was walking, which he did early and with great purpose, he was already following his father around the property in the small boots Della had found at the Grantsville Mercantile, picking up rocks and sticks with the concentrated attention of a person conducting research. He had Henry's serious gray-green eyes and Della's directness, which combination Henry found both admiring and occasionally exhausting. Della's small business grew steadily through those years. By the time James was 2, she was supplying 3 establishments in Harlan Creek and 2 in Grantsville. She had a reputation in the county for quality that brought people to her directly, and she had a small income of her own that she managed herself, and about which Henry had no authority and no desire to have any. She brought the same methodical intelligence to the business that she brought to everything, and it grew accordingly. She and Henry were, in the way of people who have chosen each other honestly, very good together. They disagreed sometimes, because she had strong opinions and he had strong opinions, and when they collided it was not a small event. But they fought the way people fight who fundamentally respect each other, directly, without cruelty, and with a willingness to change position when the argument was sound. He came around to her way of thinking about 3 things that year, and she came around to his on 2, and the general equilibrium of the household was one of comfortable equality, which was not entirely the fashion of the time, but was entirely the fashion of them. She read. He had not known she was a reader until she found his books one afternoon, and went quiet in a way that was the quiet of appetite. And after that they were frequently both reading in the evenings in the same room, which he found was its own particular kind of companionship, the comfortable sharing of silence with another person, something he had not had in 4 years before she came, and which he had missed more than he had known. In 1887, Crest Ridge County had a difficult summer. A drought came in June and stayed through August, drying the creek and browning the pastures and reducing the river to a thin thread that barely served the stock. Henry moved the cattle to the high pasture where there was still some grass and hauled water twice a day, and watched the sky with the particular wariness of a rancher who knows that one bad season can undo years of work. Other ranchers in the county were harder hit. Pete Dawson's old place, which had been bought by a family named Archer, lost most of their herd. The small farms south of town were suffering. Della organized something that no one had exactly asked her to organize, but that was clearly needed. She talked to Burl Pickett, who talked to Reverend Miles, and between the three of them they arranged a shared supply system for the worst-off families, where those with surplus shared with those without, tracked carefully, and without the particular humiliation of charity. She ran the records of it herself, in a ledger she kept at the kitchen table, and she was matter-of-fact about it in the way that people who have been without are matter-of-fact about helping those who are without theater or self-congratulation. Henry helped where he could, lending his 2 ranch hands to the Archer family for 2 weeks to help bring in whatever the drought had left of their hay. He told the Archers it was because he had extra hands, which was not quite true, but saying it that way meant they could accept it, and the Archers were proud people. The drought broke in September with a week of rain that filled the creek and turned everything green again overnight in the way that country sometimes does after rain, as though the color had been waiting just under the surface. The cattle came back to the lower pastures fat enough, and the Turners came through the summer without catastrophic loss, which Henry took as a small grace and was grateful for accordingly. Their daughter was born in November of 1887, a week after the first snow of the season, in the same room where James had been born, with the same doctor and the same Mabel crone. She was smaller than James had been and quieter about her arrival, looking at the world when she opened her eyes with a calm, dark-eyed assessment that was so purely her mother that Henry laughed in the middle of the exhausted relief. They called her Frances, for Della's mother, who had died in Ohio when Della was 16, and who Della spoke of rarely and with the great care people take with things that matter very much. Frances Turner from her earliest months was a watchful and expressive person, which was a combination that suggested a particular future, as Mabel Crone observed when she came to see the baby and found the infant regarding the ceiling with an air of profound opinion. "That is a child who will have something to say," Mabel said. "She gets it from both sides," Henry said, which Della responded to with a look that contained several things at once. James was immediately devoted to his sister in the way that small children sometimes are to new arrivals, with a protective seriousness that made him follow Della around when she was holding Frances and watch the operation with the concentrated attention he brought to all important matters. He was 3 and very sure of things, and the very sure quality he had about everything he applied to the responsibility of being a brother. And Henry watched his son with a quiet astonishment at the particular miracle of character appearing early in a person. The years settled into the shape of things built right, stable, warm, alive with the ordinary extraordinary business of people who have chosen well. The ranch grew steadily under Henry's management. He added a second barn in 1888 and increased the herd to 400 the following year. He hired a permanent ranch hand, a young man of 22 named Eli Crow who had come out from Missouri with more willingness than experience, and who Henry taught methodically over 2 seasons until he was genuinely useful and later genuinely good. Eli Crow ate supper at the Turner table 3 evenings a week and was entirely respectful and slightly in awe of Della's cooking, which she accepted with amusement. He had an ongoing friendship with James, who was old enough to follow Eli around with the idolizing attachment of a small boy for a young man, which Henry observed with both warmth and the distinct memory of doing the same thing himself at that age. Della expanded her kitchen business in 1889. The hotel in Grantsville wanted her to supply their kitchen 3 times a week. She said yes, and organized the logistics of it with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything, and Henry helped her build a second storage cellar for the increased production of preserved goods, cutting the blocks himself over 2 weekends. She brought James to help, 7 years old and very serious about his role in it, and Henry taught him how to use the mallet with the careful specificity of a father who respects the intelligence of children. Francis, at 2, was already verbal and opinionated in a way that was clear even when the words themselves were still being assembled. She had a habit of walking directly to whatever she wanted with the confidence of someone who has never considered the possibility of not reaching it, which Henry found both delightful and useful as a guide to her general disposition. On an evening in the autumn of 1889, when James was 4 and Francis was not quite 2, Henry and Della sat on the porch after the children were in bed, in the cooling September air with the sky enormous above the plains and the crickets going in the grass. The ranch was quiet in the way it got quiet in the evenings, the cattle settled, the barn shut, the lamp burning low in the kitchen window behind them. Della had her hand in his, which had become the particular habit of evenings on the porch, her hand in his and his thumb moving sometimes and sometimes still. He was looking at the sky and she was looking at something he could not see, in the particular way she sometimes went into her own thoughts while remaining entirely present. "I was thinking today," she said, "about the fence post." He looked at her sideways. The lamp light from the window touched the side of her face and the escaped strands of her hair. She had lines at the corners of her eyes now that had not been there when she arrived, and she was 32, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever looked at. "What about it?" he said. "I was thinking about what I was doing when I left that plate there," she said. She looked at him. "I was thinking that I had no idea what I was doing. I made too much food and I knew there was a lonely man who ate badly at the end of this road and I thought it was just a kind thing to do. I was not thinking anything beyond that. And now," he said. "And now," she said, "I think that the things we do without a plan are sometimes the most important ones. Because I was not planning anything. I was just following some instinct I didn't think twice about. I tracked your boot prints 3 miles into town," he said. 4 miles, she said immediately, which was exactly right. He laughed. She laughed. The crickets went on in the grass. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for leaving it." She looked at him with those warm, dark eyes and something in them that was full and steady and permanent. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to find me." He brought her hand up and kissed it, the way he had in the lamplight kitchen 6 years ago, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on the porch in the Colorado evening, while the stars came out one by one in the enormous sky over their land, over their house, over the barn where the horses were settled, and the south pasture where the cattle grazed, and the kitchen garden where the last autumn things were still growing slowly, and the kitchen garden cellar full of the summer's preserves, and the children sleeping inside in the good, clean quiet of the house they had built together, and everything was, in the simplest and most complete sense of the word, home. He had not eaten a meal he did not cook himself for 4 years, and then she had left one on his fence post, and he had tracked her down, and the whole rest of it had followed from that. The breakfast in the hotel dining room, the arrangement that was not quite what it seemed, the evenings by the fire and the winter kitchen and the foaling barn, and the ring with the garnet and the green dress in the March church, and the son with the serious eyes, and the daughter with her mother's certainty, and the years of ordinary, extraordinary days between 2 people who had found each other by the particular accident of a covered plate, and the stubbornness of a man who believed in going to the source. He thought about that sometimes, about the chain of it, each link visible in retrospect but invisible at the time, as they always were. The boot prints in the frost, The smell of roasted chicken in a kitchen that had smelled of nothing but beans for 4 years. The decision to saddle Smoke and ride south because he was a man who needed to understand things. He would never have called himself lucky. He was a practical man, and he did not rely on luck. But he had come to understand, the kind of man who, when something good came toward him, did not step aside. He went and found it. He tracked it down, practically, methodically, with boot prints in the dirt and a gray horse named Smoke. And when he got there, he was honest about what he found and what he felt, and she had been honest back. And that, as it turned out, was all it had taken. The lamp in the kitchen window burned steady. The stars spread out over Colorado. Della Turner, who had been Della Ramsey, sat beside her husband on the porch of the house that was hers in every sense that mattered, with her hand in his and the whole of their life behind and ahead. And the evening was exactly large enough to hold everything they had made together and everything that was still to come. And they sat in it the way people sit in things that are theirs, with a comfort that goes all the way down to the ground. Inside, James stirred in his sleep and settled. Francis did not stir at all, being a deeply committed sleeper from the beginning. The barn cats made their rounds. Smoke shifted in his stall. The last of the cricket sound drifted up to the porch on the September air, and the stars came out further, and Henry Turner held his wife's hand in the dark and was entirely, thoroughly, irreversibly glad of every single thing that had led him here, starting with a covered plate and a length of blue ribbon on a fence post on a frost-cold October morning, which was exactly, he had always thought, where the real story had begun.